Hey witches, Tiffany here on Bewitching.Bemused. I am back with another book review. I know it's been a while, and this one I'm super excited. Is part of my whole motherhood, I don't want to say series. I guess I'll have a playlist dedicated to being a witchy mother. So yeah, I suppose we'll call it a series. Today I am covering Witchy Mama by Melanie Marquis and Emily A. Francis. This is the paperback copy. It is 254 pages long, and I would call this an earth-based instruction guide and list of exercises and suggestions for various situations that might occur during pregnancy, delivery, and childbirth and child raising. Early childhood raising. I do want to be clear about that, and I'll sort of touch on that a little later. Let's start with the pros. First of all, I love that this book is written so you can kind of skip around depending on where you are in your current journey and what you might need out of it. I read it cover to cover, and then I sort of earmarked, or you could see my little post-it notes, things that I already think are going to be super helpful. But of course there's an index and there is a table of contents for me to flip to later if I go, oh, that book had that one thing in it. So I do recommend that you read it cover to cover, but just know that later on it works as a reference manual. You can kind of just flip through it. But in my opinion, it's good to get acquainted with books like this and know what the content holds. You might forget some of it, but you have a general gist of the book covers that, the book doesn't cover that. So you know this is a book you can rely on when this situation pops up. Admittedly, you probably will get more out of the book if you get it early into your pregnancy. I got it and read all the way through it during my first trimester, and I feel like that'll have the most impact. Almost the first half of the book, almost the first half is all about pregnancy. But don't get me wrong, it does also cover things like bath time magic and nursing, healing, bedtime magic, raising a child in a magical home. So it's not like it's going to be a complete waste if you pick it up a little bit later in your journey. That said, it is an instruction manual with a ton of variety. Just about any situation that this book happens to cover, if you flip to that section, you're going to find more than one piece of advice in there. It's very rarely just like, hey, here's one ritual for this one situation. There's often multiple customs, traditions, suggestions for herbs or crystals, rituals, visualizations, meditations, etc., for each section, which I really love because this book isn't geared toward one particular path or one particular practice. So it gives you a lot to work with for those of us who are eclectic. Now there is a downside to that, but I will touch on that in the cons section. Additionally, now that I've brought up variety, I can't leave out the fact that this book has such an amazing mix of cultural traditions. Now, a lot of the time when you pick up these general books that are not geared specifically to one type of culture, tradition, or practice, a lot of it is still going to be very American or Eurocentric. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing because a lot of my own practice comes from Eurocentric traditions and American folk practices. And much of the time that just comes from, well, that is just what the author knows, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it was kind of a breath of fresh air to see traditions and customs in here that come from Central and East Asia, as well as Africa, and a couple of other places that I've never really come across those particular magical traditions outside of their mythology because they just aren't really covered in these generalized eclectic books. Just to be clear, nothing that's listed in there is coming from a closed practice, and still some people may not identify with those, or they may feel it's inappropriate. That's perfectly fine. I just like that it's there and accessible for those people who are seeking that sort of thing, and it just feels much more inclusive. I just kind of appreciate seeing a general eclectic magic book that breaks away from the norm, from the mold. Finally, for the pros, this book is very, very practical. It does cover things like the need for self-care. There is also a section on just getting back your energy when you are a tired parent and you need a boost to get through the day. And a lot of the things that it touches on are just very practical needs that you might need through pregnancy, delivery, and child rearing. It is just chock full of lists of tips and tricks and advice in the form of rituals, visualizations, crystals and stones, meditations, etc. However, that does bring us to our cons. While practicality can be great, and we do want some of that, that is a need for sure that is fulfilled in this book, I did find it surprisingly lacking in emotional depth, which I especially found surprising because the two authors kick off the entire book with their own very personal stories about the starts of their journeys into motherhood. And okay, yes, throughout the book, there are, of course, mentions of stress and anxiety and fear that comes with having a child and raising a child. And there are helpful suggestions in those cases, but to be honest, a lot of it remains pretty surface level in regards to some of the more difficult emotions that might come up, as well as the full spiritual change that one goes through during this transition from not being a parent to being a parent. I have just started my second trimester, so I haven't even gone through the pain and the overwhelming joy and terrifyingness of delivery, let alone actually having my child in my hands and going, holy crap, this little being completely depends on me for survival. And although a good amount of my emotional state is hormonal, not to say that that invalidates my emotional state. If anything, I just think that that goes to show how our feelings are so interwoven in the biological process of creating a child. But I can already tell you that this whole thing is such a roller coaster on both an emotional and a spiritual level. I, as a person, am evolving. I am literally creating life. And it doesn't matter what way that you're becoming a parent, bringing a child into your life is such a deeply and profoundly altering experience. And I do feel like that is just not delved deeply enough into in this book. Additionally, while there are customs and traditions, rituals, and earth-based techniques to help you with healing, minor healing, colic, soothing an upset child, etc., it doesn't really dig deeper into the really hard parts of parenthood, and it also doesn't go beyond the toddler years. So I'm talking about things to assist a parent in dealing with a miscarriage or a stillbirth, dealing with a child's very serious illness, walking a child and helping them through the process of grieving the first time that they lose an older loved one or a pet. So yes, while this book is very common in helping you deal with everyday things that crop up from time to time for pretty much everyone, there's some really important topics that just aren't touched on at all. My next con is something I mentioned earlier. Now, I misspoke earlier. I did say that almost half the book deals with pregnancy and the actual childbirth experience. It's more like a third of the book, a little over a third of the book. So forgive me, I did misspeak earlier. However, that is still over a third of the book, which is a lot. And of course, as somebody who is going through a traditional pregnancy, will be going through a childbirth, I did find that section helpful. I'm not saying that it was not helpful for me. It definitely was, but as I've mentioned multiple times already, pregnancy is not the only way to become a parent. And I completely understand if the majority of the section that's on bringing a child into the world is focused on pregnancy. I do understand that, but there wasn't even so much as a single chapter dedicated to surrogacy, adoption, becoming a step parent, or being a support partner. And I really think that's a shame because that just leaves out assistance for all of those people in those situations. Part of wanting this book to be inclusive is because this journey isn't just for me. I am sharing it with my husband. Obviously, it's a lot more on me than it is him, but at the same time, he's becoming a parent for the first time too. And as I read these books, you know, him and I are reading What to Expect When You're Expecting at the same time. This book only gives me so much to share with him, and it only gives me so much to offer to him and say, hey, you should read this chapter. And it also essentially forces them to skip through a third of the book before they get to something that's relevant to themselves. I think most people would be very understanding of that, as well as would totally expect it. I mean, just look at the cover. It's got a visibly pregnant woman who's holding her pregnant belly. And finally, another thing that I kind of touched on in the prose list and said there's a flip side to this. There are several lists in this book that are just sort of shallow and often trivialize the information that they contain. And it appears to just be for the sake of keeping it, concise and easy to digest, a list to kind of skim. Now, it's very possible that the authors wanted to add more and this was an editor's choice, which is really unfortunate because I think a lot of it is very valuable information. But unfortunately, it leaves you kind of having to either just go off of what's in the book, the limited information, 1 or 2 sentences that are in the book, or now you got to go to a whole separate resource to do further reading when it could have just been contained in here to begin with. And some of these things I don't think can really be narrowed down to just a list format. Also, I will say, and I'll admit this is totally a me thing, some of the lists I didn't think should have been in there to begin with. For instance, there's a whole section of dream symbol interpretation. Now, if you guys have been following me for any amount of time, you probably know that I fully believe that it is your job to interpret your own dreams. And I don't say job in a bad way. I just mean if you find a dream book, those symbols are not necessarily going to line up with what's appearing in your own mind and how your own mind works, because symbols are very subjective. So that's like a pet peeve I have. That's very personal though. I don't even know if it should be on the con list. That's just a me thing. Instead, I think it's way more useful to provide people with an instruction manual on how to do their own legwork to basically analyze their own mind in order to unscramble the meaning behind their own dreams, because it is a deeply personal thing. So to wrap this up, in general, myself being the target audience, I did really enjoy this book. I will admit, a lot of the information was pretty introductory and basic, not necessarily in a bad way. Some of it was a good reminder. Some of it took a whole bunch of mishmash of information that I already knew, and it did bring it down to a concise list, that's not entirely a con. That can be a helpful thing. And like I said, you can see several post-it notes in here. I obviously did find useful information, but I'm also not gonna say I didn't learn anything new. I absolutely did, with the variety of culture that's in the book, as well as just myself starting off to view things from the perspective of a mother. I would say that where this book suffers is that it's just too short. Again, that may not have been author's choice. That might have been the editors or the publishers. I don't know. Or if it was author's choice, they may have just felt that that's how it flowed better. However, personally, I am all about give me all of the information. Give me all the knowledge. I liked this book, but I think if the authors had expounded on several things that they just sort of touched on, explored the more difficult parts of parenthood, and offered more assistance to those who are coming into parenthood by other means, I would have easily loved this book. Like I said, there are still a ton of useful rituals and customs in this book. So if you're interested in checking it out for yourself, the Amazon link is down below. If you're interested in more videos on witchy motherhood, you can check out this playlist right here.